Hi, I'm Ted Pattison of Critical Path Training. Here talking with my good friend Jeff DeVerter about SharePoint, past, present, and future.
So, hey everybody, we're here with Ted Pattison of Critical Path Training here at TechEd 2011. And I wanted to take a minute to sit down and visit with Ted, and we'll talk some SharePoint. So let's rewind the reel a little bit. When did you first get into SharePoint? And what was kind of where were you coming out of, and what was that first experience
Well, I was
like?
doing a lot of work with C#, .NET, ASP.NET, and just as fortune would have it, I was doing some seminars for Microsoft on Windows Server, and I was doing 10 lectures, and 2 were on this new thing called SharePoint. And kind of what I saw was that it was getting to be more and more popular. It was based on .NET and ASP.NET, but no one at Microsoft could explain it. So it just looked like a good niche to get into, as an educator.
Right.
And just have, watched, the version I got into, SharePoint 2003, was the first version that had .NET into it. And I've kind of just lived through the evolution of, SharePoint as a .NET development platform.
So from a platform perspective, how have you seen that shift as, you came in 03, which then became 07, which now we're 2010. So what does that lens look like as you look at the product as a platform differently as it's evolved here into 2010?
Well, it really exploded in 2007. 2003, we could pretty much do web parts, event handlers, and site definitions. And then all of a sudden they added features and solution packages and gave us this basis for real software engineering to do a business solution and push it out in a reliable way. And then all of a sudden there was like 15 different types of components. And so kind of what we saw in 2007 is that the platform was great, but the tools were non-existent. So with 2010, all of a sudden we see that the tools catch up to the platform, and it's a great place to be creating things. And I think now what we're seeing is that everything they did in 2003 and 2007 was kind of created for the on-premise model. No one had started talking about clouds. The marketing people weren't coming into the SharePoint team and bugging them yet, to fit into this cloud model. And so now there's all kinds of things that we could do to the server that are wonderful things for developers, but aren't great things for the IT staff and the reliability and the deployability. And they kind of assume that you own the farm.
Right.
And so now we're kind of in this world where we're trying to make this push from the on-premise model to the cloud model, and you don't own the farm anymore.
Right.
And so kind of we have this first generation of the sandbox, which now we're kind of all starting to feel out.
Right.
And for every 10 things that you can do in the server side, farm solutions, you can do 2 of those inside the sandbox.
In the sandbox. And from a functionality perspective, of those 2 things, do you get the same functionality that you would have had in the full farm?
Oh, absolutely not. You don't get the full functionality. And I think the best example, if you haven't done any work with the sandbox inside of SharePoint, is that your code can execute on the server, but it can't make a simple HTTP GET request out to a public web service. So then we're kind of forced with this new complexity of having to kind of push our code out to the client side so it executes in the context of the browser. So enter the, now the SharePoint developer requirements to know Silverlight, to know JavaScript, to know jQuery, which we really didn't have in 2007.
That's right. In fact, kind of frowned upon from, why would you do that on the client side?
That's right, just because there was kind of this lack of productivity with JavaScript. We didn't have jQuery yet, and so you could do things so much faster on the server. But now we're kind of being forced to go to these new worlds.
Go out to now you use the term cloud. That's the buzzword these days. I call it the new Kleenex. So it's a tissue. Now we're going to call it a Kleenex. Well, it's a server, but now we're going to talk about it as a cloud. How do you define cloud when you use the term?
Well, you don't own the hardware. The hardware is somewhere else.
Okay.
So we kind of save on having to have an IT staff that knows how to administrate stuff. But quite often, specifically for SharePoint, it's kind of the move from you controlling the farm, to you kind of living in this little apartment where someone else, runs the building, and you have a lot, less control.
That's right. Or in some cases where you have a management company taking care of, let's call it taking care of your real estate property that maybe still is its own physical house, but you've got somebody else taking care of it. As a developer, what impact does that have on you specifically How do you?
Well, I think, right at the beginning of a project now, we have to say, is this going to be a farm solution? And are there anything that, we have to really assume that we can't deploy as a farm solution, we have to deploy as a sandbox solution.
Yeah.
And that changes everything from your, design capabilities, how we design things, right through the implementation.
Right. Now, is one intrinsically better or worse than the other?
Well, I think you're kind of risking, the trade-off is, more control versus more risk.
Right.
And so do you want to deal with risk? And in many situations, risk is not an option for the people in control.
Yeah.
So
That's right.
sometimes you don't decide what level of risk; it's decided for you. Office 365.
Right.
I think now we're in a stage where Office 365 is just kind of now into beta, and it's everyone's now just going to feel out what's really possible, what works inside there, and what doesn't, and what are the new design patterns that are going to emerge.
Right. Now, somebody like myself who's been through the developer classes that you've got, and it's, get Visual Studio open, write your code, compile your code, deploy it to the server. What impact does that have and have you looked at what the impact is in an Office, specifically to Office 365? Does that scenario still even exist for you, or is it all about the jQuery Silverlight client-side based?
Well, there's certain things that you could do. Take a simple branding solution.
Okay.
A branding solution doesn't have a lot of executable code.
Right.
So let's say that I'm not using a publishing site, but I'm using a team site, and I'm using Office 365, and I want to use my own master page, but I have a site collection, so you don't really get support out of the box to have a single master page provision. Mm-hmm. So what we do is we basically push up a master page, we push up a CSS file, a bunch of PNG files, and then we just have a simple feature receiver, 10 lines of code that basically walks the site collection, takes all the sites and points them up to the top level site. So those type of things, work great. And I think a branding solution is probably the perfect example of something that doesn't really change, between the farm
Story's the
and
same.
the sandbox.
So whether it's here or whether it's in a sandbox solution on Office 365.
And I'm kind of seeing the best practice now is if you're not sure, design for the sandbox. Don't put things inside the SharePoint root directory, inside the images, when you could stick it inside the style library and have it sandbox friendly.
Right.
It's not going to really affect you performance-wise.
Right.
In a farm solution. I've also seen this. Let's say in 2003, as we evolved to 2007, we didn't really think about anything but the on-premise model.
Right.
So there was this tendency to throw more stuff into SharePoint.
Yeah.
Let's throw another service app and another service app and another service app, and maybe we need to start going the other way, where we don't need to put it in SharePoint.
Yeah.
SharePoint just needs to be able to talk to it. And I think now that the cloud or the off-premise model is probably better than cloud.
Yeah.
The off-premise model is really kind of forcing us to rethink, where we're going to put our data, where we're going to put our UI.
What do you want to be next from a sandbox solution perspective? What is causing pain today?
Well, the fact that my code can't call to a public web service, is the number one growing pain.
What is the reason, do you think? Is it a security boundary? Is it a...
It's a security boundary, and there's some parts about the security boundary that just are implementation details. The one I like to bring up is, so they use Codex security inside the sandbox to basically stop you from using certain things in the .NET API, one of which is things like file streams. Yeah. Obviously, it's not a good idea inside the sandbox to let a developer get a file stream and talk to files on the operating system.
Absolutely.
But they just decided to take system.io and say you can't use any of it.
None of it.
So the memory stream is a very useful object. It really doesn't pose any risks, but they just kind of crossed the whole namespace out, and so now I have to use byte arrays and create some of my own utility classes to deal with things. So I think there's this idea of what they want to do, but as you go through the implementation and the release date gets sooner, you kind of start losing all your dreams and kind of how can we make this work as best as possible given the constraints and time that we had. I think that's just a normal part of software.
Yeah.
But generally we need a place to run our code that's not on-premise, that runs with a lot more rights.
Fair enough.
I see a lot of people, even with SharePoint 2010, that are starting to look into the Azure model. I take my code, I basically run it inside of Azure. There were some great sessions here. Steve Fox gave one yesterday and kind of showed this example of, you want to have your mobile phone talk to SharePoint, but that's not really going to work very well, which is kinds of authentication issues. But then if your mobile phone, talks to a service that you put up in Azure, and Azure has all kinds of configuration options and a service bus that we can create a trusted connection, back to our on-premise model.
Yes.
And then I've exposed a web service available, to any kind of device anywhere in the world. going
Right.
through Azure, and my Azure code calling back to my, and then, so I think we're going to see more solutions like that
Yes.
as we move off premise.
Very interesting. Awesome. So thanks for taking some time to talk. But where can these guys find you?
Oh, well, you can go to criticalpathtraining.com. You can go to our registration page, register for all our training classes.
Awesome.
And we
Just
have a
a
lot of good stuff, a lot of free webinars and stuff like that. So free resources as well.
That's awesome. All right. Thanks, Ted. Enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jeff.
Take a